who betrays Jesus. Like that's pretty deep. The week before that, it's Jesus praying in the garden before, he's betrayed. That's pretty harsh. And today we're going to talk about a revolutionary insurgent who tried to take over the government because it's a guy named Barabbas. You're throwing me off. You're sitting on the wrong side today. Some of you guys switch sides of it. It's like, because church is funny. You sort of, you kind of naturally start sitting in the same place. We're not that place that's like, oh, you're in my pew, but it is kind of funny. But anyway, so we're taking what I've been calling the Easter detour, Easter excursus. It was sort of a look at the Easter story in the book of Mark, because we've been working through the gospel according to Mark. Yeah, see, you marked that in your memory. And see, just when you thought that joke was going away, it's back. I'm bringing Mark jokes back. And we're going to start in chapter 15, verse 1. It says, very early in the morning, the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. And so what had happened right before this is Jesus had been on sort of this late-night sham trial, where not sham wow, but sham trial, and they're trying to find something to accuse him of. The witnesses aren't lining up. But finally, Jesus, they directly ask him, they accuse him of blasphemy, and they got him. They got him. And now the thing is, though, if you, I know most of you are always reading Josephus, but we know from that period of history they couldn't actually put him to death. That was sort of reserved for the Roman authorities of them. So they want to put him to death, but they have to kind of bring him to the Romans. So they bring him about a quarter mile down the street, which is where Pilate had a house at the time, which is kind of cool. If you like archaeology, you can actually see some of these places. And normally Pilate lived in Caesarea, which is like the nice coastal town. I've heard there's good surfing there. No, I'm not a surfer. It's sort of the seaside town that was an administrative center. They didn't just like to be at the beach, but you kind of needed to be at the beach because, so much, going over seaports and everything. And so because Passover is this big festival, he would end up there in Jerusalem because people are coming from all over. They want to talk to him. He's sort of the Roman authority. And it's kind of like, have you ever been to Firefly? Some of you have. We do a lot of the cleanup stuff. I like to go after Firefly because it's kind of, there's nothing like being with 90,000 of your closest friends here in a small town. But it's kind of like that. If there's going to be a big festival, what do you send in? More police presence and things, and maybe some higher up people that can make some calls. So Pilate's in town because of this big festival, and remember Passover, the Jewish people are celebrating the fact that God liberated them out of Egypt, and so because of that too, there's also this, we'd love to be liberated from the Romans, so it's sort of a dangerous thing too, because they really have to be there in case things go bad. And Pilate it's interesting. I was reading, I find every time I study scripture and I read books, I find out more things. It's interesting. Pilate was really anti-Semitic. He didn't like Jewish people, and they put him in charge of the Jewish people. So he had a couple of run-ins where he'd done some things that were in retrospect not so smart. He brought some images of Caesar in. There's a little bit of revolt there. There's some different things going on, and so they bring him to there, and so he's in Passover, doesn't like the Jewish people, but wants to keep order. And it says, so they bring him to him, they hand him over to Pilate, and this was like a normal thing to do, to show up at Pilate's house. This is when you could appeal things to him. And they say, so Pilate goes, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You have said so." And Rome is really always on the lookout again for these revolutionaries, people who are trying to take over the government, people who, again, the Jewish people hated being under them. And I think for a lot of us that's hard to understand, but it'd be like if the Canadians invaded. we laugh because most of us are not, terrified of the Canadians. Maybe if you've seen Canadian Bacon, you'd see it differently, which is a movie that some of you are like, what the? No, because Canadian Bacon, it's just ham. Like, that's just wrong. But, and the picture, Canada comes, they take over, and then we had to sort of, pay homage to them. We'd be like looking for our chance to revolt and get back real bacon. And so that's kind of this thing. And so they're always looking out for people who are going to lead revolutions. And so it says in verse 3, the chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of? And Jesus made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. And it's kind of a funny scene because he's getting all these accusations, and Jesus is just kind of being quiet. Now, most of you, anyone have like an older brother or sister? Or a little brother or sister? If they did something, and you are getting blamed by your parents, aren't you going to speak up? Like, who's just like, yeah, I didn't do it, my little sister did, but I'll go ahead and take the blame and be, on restriction for a couple of weeks, or, I'll take the paddling. In my day, they could still paddle. I don't think we're allowed to do that anymore. But if you're at school and a teacher blames you for something, aren't you like I'm like looking at all the teachers now because it's awkward. But you kind of like, you're like, oh no, it wasn't me. You're going to defend yourself. But Jesus is just kind of sitting there because he's not. He's not concerned that he's going to be, concerned with wrongful death. People would normally grovel to Pilate, trying to make their case, going, I know you have the power to kill me. I'd prefer not to be dead, because most of us would prefer not dead over dead. And so all this is happening, and it's interesting because Jesus is just being quiet, because one, he's not concerned, because he's willing to die for us, and we sort of know the outcome, so it's a little harder, I think, for us sometimes to get in the story because we know where it's all going. We just like, how often when you're reading this whole section, you're just like skipping ahead to the end because it's like a movie. If you've seen it enough times, you kind of like you skip over it. Anyone just watch the scenes they like all the fights in Rocky, that's all you want to see, or and so it's easy to kind of skip over some of this stuff because you know the beginning, the end. And so if Jesus says, I'm the Messiah, then he's potentially this threat to Rome. And the Jewish people, the authorities, it wasn't all the Jewish people, it was just these religious authorities that don't like him. Then he can say he's a threat to Rome. And if Jesus says, I'm not the Messiah, then the leaders can kind of go, well, then he's not a threat to us. And so there's this sort of silence, because ultimately Jesus is dying for a purpose. And Mark 14, we talked about this. It said, Jesus is in the garden, he's praying, he said, Father, take this cup from me. Take this thing that I have to do, this difficult thing, this crucifixion, but not as I want, but as you want. And it's not that Jesus was trying to get out of it, but it's a really big deal to die for our sins. It's a really big thing that he's suffering, but because of his great love for us, he's willing to go through this. And it reminds me of, and I tried to Google it. Everyone try to Google something, you're like, you don't even know exactly what to Google. I was trying to Google this to find who did this. I was a heavy metal guy. Eddie, Denise and I were like metalheads for sure, and headbangers. And so I like heavy metal, and when I was coming to faith in Jesus, people gave me like Christian heavy metal, and some of you were like, I didn't know that existed. And then somebody gave me, actually, when we were living in Los Angeles, they gave me like a suitcase full of CDs. So I have a giant assortment of Christian metal, and I'm not talking Stryper. And I remember because someone gave me like Petra or something. They're like, this is hard rock. I'm like, what? Like, I'll keep trying it, but you're gonna have to go a little harder than that. I'm like an Ozzy, Iron Maiden, and Black Sabbath guy. Somebody like, yeah. Yeah, Alex got to meet like Alex Cooper. That was awesome. Anyway, so I'm kind of, and I remember there was this, and I couldn't find the '90s Christian metal artist who did this, but there was this lyric, and it's still in my head, and I kind of sing it in a heavy metal tune. It's like, born to die so we might live. And does anyone recognize that? This is my Google. Does anyone? No. Okay. I'm gonna have to listen to hundreds of CDs to find this. But like, that's the the purpose of Jesus. Jesus was born to die so we might live. And I'm hearing the chorus in the back there. And it comes down to God's plan all along, because we sin, we go our own way, we do the wrong things, but God constantly has this plan to bring us into a relationship with him. Isaiah 53, Isaiah is in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. This is like way before Jesus. So, but I want to read this. Isaiah 53, starting in verse 6. All of us like sheep have strayed away. Sound familiar? We have left God's path to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. Sounding like Jesus? Yeah, spoiler alert. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, that his life was cut short in midstream, but he was struck down for the rebellion of my people. He had done no wrong. He had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. Man, if you know the story of Jesus, that sounds awfully familiar, right? And this is like a long time before Jesus, because it's God's plan all along to make this way for us to have life. And so we come to verse 6. It says, and now it was the custom at the festival, this Passover festival, to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man named Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. And so this crowd of people is like, well, you're going to release a prisoner. And Pilate's thinking, well, this is easy. They're going to choose Jesus. He doesn't seem to have done anything really wrong, so we'll let him go. And it was this sort of, the custom was to release somebody because that kind of picture, again, this is Passover. There's this sentiment about wanting to be freed from the Roman oppression. And so the fact that they're sort of giving someone back to you sort of is like appeasing them a little bit, like maybe diffusing things. They're trying to win the hearts of the people that they're governing, because really the Romans only really only care about one big thing, right? Tax money. So as long as the taxes are flowing in, as long as there's no big rebellions, they're happy. So they're just trying to appease people. And so they get this guy named Barabbas. Now, I laugh every time I hear the name Barabbas. Do you know why? Because it's funny. Denise and I were sitting in the office last night. We were talking about something. I was like, yeah, we're going to talk about Barabbas. And I just chuckled because, for us, it's just a name, right? And most of us have a name that means nothing to us, right? I don't think about the origin and meaning of the name Jeff every time I say, I don't think of the origin and the meaning of Grant every time I talk to Grant. David, I might kind of think about King David and stuff, but most of us don't think about and so Barabbas, it actually means, bar, which is the Aramaic word for son. Ben was Hebrew. And we get bin, like bin something, and the only one I can think of right now is bin one. I don't want to say that one. And so Abba, some of you know, if you know from other Bible verses, father. So it's the son of the father, which I think is just funny. He's his daddy's son. He ugly. Little juju on that beat. So some of you get that, some of you don't. But, so he's daddy's son. His dad may have been like a rabbi or something, we don't know. So there's this guy named Barabbas. And so because I have to have that in my head, you now have to have that in yours. So there's this guy named Barabbas. And so he goes, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. He knew, hey, the priests just don't like Jesus because he's more popular. They don't like his interpretation. But they knew, hey, Jesus is popular with the people. And so, he doesn't realize kind of the crowd that's gathered here is sort of a selective crowd. Because again, it's early in the morning. Who gets up at like a ridiculously early morning and goes to Pilate's house? They would have gathered sort of their crowd of people who didn't like Jesus. And so, he says, but the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you call the king of Jews? Pilate asked them. Crucify him, they shouted. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, And they had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. And, he wants to placate the crowd. He wants to make them happy. And so he's willing to let Jesus die because he really, in the end, doesn't care. And it's kind of funny because I was thinking, why is the crowd seeming like why would you choose Barabbas? And I've been reading this book. I told you some last week. I try to read a book every year on something with the crucifixion thing because the story can become so familiar. I've been reading this story. I've been reading the Bible for a long time. I've read it through multiple times. And so it's easy to kind of, when you read the story, to sort of skip over details, maybe not think of some of the things. And so I've been reading this book this year that I found randomly on Amazon, because that's a great thing. And I was reading this, and it says, if you picture yourself as part of that crowd, which one do you pick? Now, you would all pick Jesus, I know, because you guys are good, godly, people. Okay, no. Which one? I lost my place. If you picture, you're like, no wonder. If you picture yourself as part of the crowd, which one do you pick? One is going to lead you by force, throw out the Romans, reclaim your tax money, wealth, and prosperity, and restore the strength of the Jewish kingdom. The other's leadership involves loving those same oppressors, serving them as they dwell among you, doubling the service they demand of you. Whom do you wish to set free? Who do you wish to see destroyed? And you really, because we know who Jesus is and we understand his plan, we can kind of see we're thinking, why didn't they choose Jesus? Or at least I was. But really they're going, what we choose here is the revolutionary. What we choose is to get rid of our oppressors. What we choose is to kick the Canadians out of our country. Making them Canadians, though, this just doesn't sound scary, I'm sure the Canadians are tough. I'm sure someone here is of Canadian descent. They're going to correct me later. But, you're going to choose the people who seem to serve your best interest. And so they choose him. Often, I was thinking about that, how crazy it is. But really, if we're honest, we often trade our relationship with God for stuff we'd rather have. We often make good things into God things. Now, God created everything. There's stuff is good. But we take things that God created and we put it outside of the way he created us to have it. And so we take things and we make good things into God things. And we take people, they become the gods in our lives. Whether it's our children or spouses, people we like, we take money, we take experience, we take all these things, and we'll often trade it because we want what we think's best for us. Now, I think American churchianity in itself can do that because we have this idea that this life is it. And then we want our best life now. But really, God has so much more for us. God has this bigger plan for us. And sometimes, if we're truthful, this life doesn't work out the way we wanted, right? And sometimes we get frustrated because, God doesn't give us this or that, but it's really not about our life working out perfectly. There's some hardship, there's some pain, there's something, but God, teaches us along that way. But ultimately, sometimes it shows how much we put our faith and our trust in other things and other people. Rather than God. And nothing that you give up for Jesus will be for anything that you can actually keep anyway. We'll trade our faith to make money. Last time I checked, death rate in America hovers around 100%. Because if you're born, you will die. Now, I have all kinds of funeral requests, from bowls of candy on my, on my belly and when I'm in there, and someone's got to track all these, and one of my jokes, I want to be carried to the cemetery in a U-Haul. Because people are going to be like, why is there a U-Haul in the cemetery? I heard a joke one time, and I think I've told you this joke, but I'm going to tell you again. You know, this guy who's a miserly old man, he had a lot of money, and you know, he made his wife promise, kept forcing her, said, you know, when I die, I want all my money buried with me. And finally, she relented and said, that's fine. And so at the funeral, she goes up and she puts something in the casket, and people are like, I can't believe you did it. I can't. I was talking to her afterwards. She's like, well, I wrote him a check, and he can cash it anytime he wants. But often we put our faith and our trust in things other than Jesus, and we hold on to those things. So, side note. So verse 16 says, the soldiers led Jesus away into the place that is the praetorium and called together the whole company of soldiers. And picture this scene. They put a purple robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. They began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling to their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And this is really a sad, sadistic scene. And this is really the worst of human behavior. But we see this, don't we? We see this in times of war. We see this, I picture the Braveheart scene. You know, they're sort of, he's already condemned to death, and they're torturing him to kind of get a confession. And a lot of times they would do this to kind of, one, just because they're sadistic, and that was like their way of having fun with him. A lot of the people didn't like the Jewish people, so it's their chance to, beat one up legally here. And they're mocking this whole thing, and possibly give up more information, if they had something. And it's this terrible scene because it's this great travesty. Here's the guy who lived life right, who did all the good things. He came so that we can have life, and ultimately his life ends in this terrible, terrible way. And I was kind of processing this week because we're stopping there. Like, I know, it's like we want to look ahead to the future. We'll talk a little bit about that because, the story, we know it has a good ending, right? But ultimately, Jesus is king. But the disciples and often the Jewish people at the time, my academic interests lie in this sort of, this time period where there's these expectations of this conquering Messiah. They wanted a king to come. They wanted someone to kind of to take over, to kick the Romans out, like we'd want to kick the Canadians out. They wanted someone to take over, and Jesus is king, but he's not setting up the kind of kingdom they expect. They expect, a physical kingdom, but Jesus is preaching a different thing. They want power, they want position, they want paycheck. They want stuff. But Jesus is constantly with the disciples telling them, "Hey, I'm going to give up my life. It's not that kind of kingdom." But they don't hear it. They don't hear what Jesus is saying. And in Mark 10, this is. We've talked about this passage in the other Gospels. We haven't gotten to it yet. That's the tough thing of being like a little out of chronological order because we're taking this Easter detour. But in Mark 10, it's interesting because his disciples start arguing over who's the greatest. And it's, if you, I don't know, I imagine girls do it too, but guys especially, they get together and they always want to talk about who's the greatest and, whose dad can beat whose dad and, all kinds of, they just want to compare and figure everything out. My dad's here to wrestle, so no, I'm kidding. Sorry, Daddy. but it's all the, this stuff. And his disciples start jostling for position, like who's going to be best. And we'll talk about this in a while with that passage. And so, as they're kind of fighting over who's number one, Jesus says to him, Mark 10, starting verse 42, so Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flout their authority over those under them. And, surely we know people who are like this, someone who's like in charge of you and loves to throw their authority around. If you work in a school system, maybe a principal who's like, I am, no. Or, if you're, in the military, I'm sure some people have some bosses that are like, letting you know that, you can't pass them in rank and they will forever be in charge of you. And so, kind of that. But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be a slave to everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus came to serve. He's a king, but he didn't come to establish the kind of kingdom they were expecting. He came to serve. He came to love. He came to die for us. And Barabbas, I was thinking about this last night again. All the sermons come together usually Saturday night because you study all week and you're like, what am I going to say? Anyone never? No? Okay. Some of you are like, yeah, I don't know what he's going to say next either. But Barabbas is really a lot like us, right? Because, Barabbas, Jesus gives his life in place of Barabbas. Jesus gives his life in place of us. And he ultimately, he's willing to die so that we can have true life. Jesus took Barabbas's place. Jesus takes our place. And that is the gospel. In Romans chapter 5, starting verse 6, it says, when we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Now, most people would be willing to die for an upright person, though someone would not be willing to die for an upright person, although someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God, underline this in your head, or in your YouVersion if that's what you do. It says, but God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. When we were jacked up. When we were his enemies, when we didn't do the things we were supposed to do, when we go the wrong way, it says, and since we've been made in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. Verse 10, for since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son, while we were still his enemies. Our relationship with God is not based on us being good. We were God's enemies at one time. We live our lives in ways that are contrary to the gospel, contrary to how he would have us to live. And that's us. That's our story. We always say here, we're all a little jacked up. And if you think you're not a little jacked up, you're really jacked up. But the truth is, we're jacked up, we're messed up, we do the wrong things. But in the middle of that, God offers us this relationship with him. God offers this way that we can have new life. And, the truth is we always struggle, if we're truthful, with keeping Jesus then at the center of things. Because we make faith into all kinds of things it's not meant to be. I think a lot of us, you come to faith and then you sort of make Jesus into genie in a bottle. You got to rub it the right way. I'm not going to sing that one for you. But, we want Jesus to fill our wishes and desires, but really we're made to live a life that he's laid out for us that may not always look like we want it to be. And now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't care about your needs. The Bible says, we even know how to give good gifts to our children. God does want to give us good gifts, but it doesn't always look the way we want it to look. And we have this relationship, and really the biggest, best gift that God can give us is the fact that we can have this relationship with him. And then ultimately, it's about his kingdom, not ours. My problem is I always want to build it and make it about my kingdom. My stuff, my things. 1 Timothy 1 says this, starting verse 15. This is a trustworthy saying, and everyone should accept it. This is a guy named Paul writing. It says, Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I am the worst of them all. But God had mercy on me so that Christ Jesus could use me as a prime example of his great patience, even with the worst sinners. And Paul is interesting. If you haven't read the rest of the New Testament, so we start off with Jesus. He's, we're going to celebrate at Easter that, I'm thinking of all these, April, because Easter's on April Fool's Day this year, surprise, I'm back. You thought I was dead. And so after that, this guy named Paul shows up who doesn't like this idea of Jesus as the Messiah. And he's persecuting the church. He's overseeing people being killed, but then kind of jokes on him because Jesus shows up to him in this kind of cool, incredible way. And he goes from being the guy who killed Christians, who wasn't even just satisfied with, getting the ones in his city, wanted to go off to other cities, get them all, stamp this whole thing out. And then Paul ultimately becomes this apostle to the Gentiles. He becomes, God's chosen vessel to take this out to the rest of it. So he goes from terrorist killing Christians to the guy who's telling everyone about Jesus. And so I love that. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and I am the worst of them all. And so ultimately that is the gospel. That is the good news. That once we were alien, we were far off, we were separate from God, but he makes a way for us to know him. It's interesting because the real son of the Father dies, Barabbas, so that we can have a relationship with the Father. And as we approach Easter, that's something we need to be mindful of. We talked about, it was a few weeks ago, the ABCs of salvation. It's admit, believe, and commit. We have to admit, we're a sinner. We've made some mistakes. We've gone wrong. And then when we believe that Jesus is God's Son, and that He chose to die for us. And then is this commit yourself to a life of following Jesus. If you're not a believer, you can be. If you're not in on this Jesus party, you can be. It's just about making that commitment and then following and changing your life to be someone who follows after Jesus. Now, some of you might go, and if you want more to talk about, I would love to talk to you about that personally after this. But, the thing is, if you're a believer, I know a lot of us, people would say, I follow Jesus. We have to ask ourselves, what are the things really keeping me from following? Because things have a way of slipping into our life and we take the good things, we make them God things. What are the things in my life that are keeping me from following? What are the things that keep me from truly, fully following Jesus? And I challenge you this Easter season, renew your faith. Commit to following. Nothing is more valuable than a life of following Jesus. It's free, but it'll cost you everything. It'll cost you everything, but I assure you the reward is priceless. As we